Welcome back to this week's Emet Inspire at Parashat Shelach. In this week's Parsha, we have the story of the spies. And originally the plan was to go right into the land of Israel, but as a result of the evil reports that the spies brought back, we know that Hashem decreed there would be 40 years in the desert. Rashi asks a question right at the beginning of the Parsha, and the question is, Lama nisbacha Parshas Meraglim, the Parshas Miriam? Why is the Parsha of the spies juxtaposed, directly connected to last week's Parsha, which talks about the Lashon Hara that Miriam spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu? And Rashi says, Lefi shelochto al iskei diba shediba ba'acheha. We know that she received saras, that she had to remove herself from the camp because she spoke diba, she spoke Lashon Hara, she didn't judge Moshe Rabbeinu favorably. It says, V'rishoyim halalu rava lokta mosor. It says these spies, and Rashi said the Rishoyim halalu, they saw it, these evil people saw it, and they didn't learn Musar from it. They didn't understand the damage that occurs when one speaks Lashon Hara. As it says in the Medrash, that's why Kodesh Baruch Hu placed the two back to back. In other words, the fact that Miriam spoke badly of Moshe Rabbeinu and received the punishment of the tzara'as, as we call it, that everyone should understand how serious it is, a sin it is to speak Lashon Hara. A person speaks Lashon Hara, they just have to reflect on what happened to Miriam. But apparently these men, the Nisim, these spies, they didn't want to learn from it. So Rashi, from the outset, is trying to understand what's the connection between Miriam's Lashon Hara and the spies, and he finds a very direct connection. That had the spies, had the Meraglim, thought deeply about the land of Israel, had they looked more carefully, they wouldn't have spoken badly. In other words, just like Miriam didn't think deeply enough about Moshe Rabbeinu, she judged Moshe Rabbeinu a little bit too quickly. She assumed that Moshe Rabbeinu was doing something wrong by having separated from his wife Zipporah, when in fact it was the command of Hashem. He was a special type of Navi. And had the spies learned a lesson from that you have to think deeply about what you see, that you can't just judge on any sort of superficial appearance, they would have come to a different conclusion about what they were actually seeing in the land of Israel. So we learn many things from this. Number one, we understand that really what is behind Lashon Hara is that we're not looking deeply enough. We're looking superficially at a person. If we would stop and think and understand that there's so much that we don't know, we wouldn't be so quick to assume and to think that a person is doing something wrong. So really what's behind Lashon Hara in many cases is a lack of introspection, a lack of using the mind to think deeply about what you're seeing. And how the spies understood that in a deeper way. Of course, they were great people, as we know, but had they just had been more inspired by this, just a little bit more, they would have understood that which they're seeing in front of them wasn't necessarily negative. And they would never have spoken the Diba, the Lashon Hara, about the land. In fact, what did they see? In fact, they said they were concerned, for example, that they saw that it was a country, was a land where they were burying the dead. There was a plague and they were burying the dead, and they came back with a report that said it's a land that wants to devour its inhabitants. When in fact, what was really happening? Kodesh Baruch Hu was creating a type of sickness, endeavor, a plague in the land, in order that the people would be so involved with their burial that they wouldn't notice the spies. But instead of stopping to think and to look carefully and to reflect on it, they jumped to a conclusion. It was, instead of seeing Hashem's chesed, they saw it as a land that was Ochle Yoshvecha, devouring its inhabitants. This is really the lesson of Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara teaches us that we have to be so careful and understand that what we see with our eyes is not always the reality. Chazal say, our sages say something very beautiful. They say, Strika be'enai beliba koi. There's a cord that connects the eye directly to the heart. In fact, they utilize this particular statement in trying to determine if the eye is an external organ or an internal organ. And it has to do with different laws on Shabbat. If the eye is an external organ, there are different laws regarding being B'chalo Shabbat to save an external organ. If it's an internal organ, then of course we're much more strict about violating Shabbat to save internal organs. And they look at the eye and they say, since the eye is connected to the heart, it's an internal organ. But I'll say to you something even deeper than that. If something is true physically, it's also true spiritually. If there's a physical connection between the eye and the heart, it also means there's a spiritual connection, which means that which the eye sees oftentimes is influenced by our emotion, is influenced by our desires. We're not as objective as we think we are. And therefore it's so important when we see something to stop and to think and to reflect. Am I seeing the whole story? And had the spies learned that lesson from Miriam, they would have come to a different conclusion as to what they were actually seeing in the land of Israel. When we take this lesson to heart and to understand when we see people and we see things that perhaps we observe that we don't understand and they don't look proper, they don't look correct. Let's stop to think for a moment and understand maybe we're not seeing the whole story. And we have to work a little bit harder to judge favorably. And by doing so, B'ezrat Hashem, we should stop any form of negative speech and only have positive speech and build avav and achdus and love between Bnei Israel. And B'ezrat Hashem, the schus of that, we should only see good things for the people of Israel in the land of Israel, B'ezrat Hashem.